This is Worship God, a podcast of the Gospel Coalition Canada. Worship God is designed to equip worshipers and worship leaders for Christ-centered worship.
Well, welcome back to the Worship God podcast. Today we have a great conversation for you, but before we dive in, we just first want to encourage you, if you've been blessed by this podcast, if this has been helpful for you, just to share these episodes. You can like and rate them wherever you listen to them. That really helps us. We also would love to hear from you. We've got a Facebook page. You can look us up at Worship God on Facebook. And as well, we have an email, and we'd love to hear from you. If you've got questions or episodes that you'd like us, topics you'd like us to cover, you can reach out to us at worshipgodpodcast@gmail.com. Well, today I am joined by my two co-hosts, Jody Cross. Jody is the lead pastor at South Shore Bible Church in Barrie, Ontario. And we are joined once again by our good friend and our brother out on the West Coast, Pat Sabell. We got the team back. Guys, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Hey, Pat. Hey, Rob. Good to see you guys.
Guys, I thought today what we could talk about is sort of a common criticism that I've, as you go online and you go on Facebook and you go on Twitter and you read articles from different guys from different backgrounds, there tends to be a common criticism that I've heard. And I'd be curious to hear if you guys have heard it. And it seems to be around the concept of the feminization of worship music, of modern worship music. And it's this kind of, people will refer to it as the Jesus is my boyfriend kind of language critique that we'll find in a lot of modern worship. I'm curious, is that something that you guys have heard yourselves, this kind of idea that, the reason that men don't sing in church is because we got all this feminine worship music kind of being produced?
Rob, I did hear, it's not something I hear a lot of, but I do know a pastor who had this concern. And he did come through the 90s as a youth leader, and there potentially were a lot more of those songs written in the 90s. And I think had a chance to look back upon them years later and realize some of the shortfalls of the extreme parts of that. So yes, and I kind of framed this in terms of not just necessarily feminine versus masculine lyrics, but more bad congregational songs, or let's just say unbalanced congregational songs.
Yeah. I think there always seems to be kind of two camps, guys. And in one camp, you got the people who are, truth only. And in the other camp, you got, it seems like they're at each other in the sense of the other camp feels like it's all about emotion and it's all about feeling. And so often I think without, either of these two camps coming too close together, they're throwing rocks over the fence at each other in a sense of like, no, that's bad. And we see it because YouTube has allowed us to see anything we want to see. From should we sing these songs from this camp, or should we not? And the importance of truth, I would say amen to that. But I definitely think that the two camps has definitely created something where we've said, that's a feminization of songs, or and this is more masculine song because it's truth. And so, that'd be my thought.
When it's often coupled with this other critique that's like, it's called like the youth group culture of modern church. And it's, you kind of find those sorts of arguments kind of thrown together. And I think it comes from, I'd be curious what you guys think of where this comes from. And you've kind of hinted towards it. I do think that it comes from a concern that there's an overemphasis on emotion and experience in worship, and a lack of theological depth and doctrine. And I think maybe ultimately the concern is, are we, in our modern worship services, are we producing shallow Christianity where, your faith is only as long as the song is. And once you go out into the work week, you kind of, you fall off the map because there's no truth, there's no doctrine underneath it. And so I think from what I can see, that seems to be the concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think that John Piper does a great job in his book, Desiring God, chapter 3. And if you're listening and you want, I think, some of the best material on truth and heart and the need for both, I think that's one of the finest books and finest chapters that you can read on this topic. I think it's vitally important that we love truth and that truth do what it was meant to do, trickle down to our hearts, and our hearts be engaged with that truth in a way that causes us to worship Jesus for who he is and what he's done.
Isn't there a phrase that of theology and doxology, and that theology fuels our doxology? And done right, the truth of God's power fuels our passion, which is, I think, what you're saying, this truth and heart piece. And, that just even thinking about pendulum swings as a generalization, I think 25 years ago, there was a reaction in the movements of the record labels, whether that was the Vineyard, Maranatha, or maybe those two particularly. But having been in a vacuum of intimacy or tender language, if we could call it that, so this whole father intimacy, nearness culture sprung up, and people hadn't been singing about that for a long time. And so the pendulum had swung from one side to the other. And then somewhere in the middle, there's a balance where both of these types of expressions are valid. And I think we'll explore that in a minute as we look at the Psalms and what kind of language they give us. But I think part of the problem is, Rob, that you said, is that when this kind of language is used, it can often become really person-centric, in the sense that these lyrics are about me, what I need, and how God is the one who meets my needs. So that feeling, intimacy, those kind of things can tip toward that way, which in a sense is, it's saying a lot more about me than probably needs to be said. And it's also saying less about God that should be said. That I would call it overemphasized immanence, which in a sense can deny God's power and glory. And so I think people can react to that as well. And it may come across as shallow or overly romanticized.
I think part of the concern is that we've lost the awe and the wonder, and there's more intimacy in our worship songs, and there's more colloquial nature, and there's reckless love, and there's sloppy wet kisses. And so, wait a second, how does this line up with what we see in the Bible in terms of how God is expressed? And so I think this idea of, would it be fair to say that the Psalms are more awe-oriented or intimacy-oriented? Like when we look at the Psalms, when we look at the scriptures and how they describe, the Psalms are the worship language of the Bible. Can we get a hint in there? Like, would some of this intimacy language be foreign in the Psalms, and it's really all just awe and look at God and fall on your face, ye heathens? What about that?
Yeah. Oh man, don't get me started. I mean, it just seems like in the Psalms there's every range of emotion being demonstrated or spoken of, and it always seems to go back to the nature and the character of God, his steadfast love, his unfailing love, his goodness. But I mean, David doesn't pull back from making it clear what he will do because of who God is. I think of Psalm 27:4. One thing I ask of the Lord, that the thing I seek the most, this is from the NLT, is to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. I love how this says it, delighting in the Lord's perfections. The ESV says to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord. Right there is delighting is to love something and to treasure it in a way that you are moved by that. And so when we behold the beauty of the Lord, the question might be, and yes, I would agree that I think there's a lot of songs out there that have, as Jody said, lent themselves to being maybe a little bit more about me and how I need to respond. But I think there is a major need for great songs that are truth saturated. But I also think there's a place where sometimes when we've just sang a song like that we need to come up for air a bit and let that land on us in a way that we sing a simple song. We sing something that just says we've just beheld the beauty of the Lord, and now we just want to tell him that we love him. And so, in the last couple weeks in my own heart, there's just been a God consciousness, a greater awareness that the Spirit indwells me and that Jesus is with me at all times. And I found myself just hundreds of times throughout the day just saying, Jesus, I love you. And I think my heart, I see the way I'm relating to my children and my wife. There's something about being with Jesus that people will take note of. And so, if we've been with Jesus throughout the week and we gather and Jesus is there by the power of his Spirit, then why would we not say, after we've just, sang a glorious hymn of who he is and what he has done, why would we not say, Jesus, I love you?
And Rob, as I looked beyond just the Psalms, and I looked, the first and last songs in the Bible, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is Exodus chapter 15, and then toward the end of Revelation. So you have, if you have a bookend, those songs are about the strength of a warrior God. And those songs are about praise to the victorious King. He's the King of the nations. The holy God is to be feared. That's the Alpha and the Omega. And in the middle, if you look at as Pat's been talking about, the Psalms, Songbook of David, you do have both the awe and the intimate songs. And, I saw things like, I pour out my heart, that idea in Psalm 62, verse 8, David saying, pour out my heart. That's really tender. That's intimate. That's friend to friend. That is, in a human context, if I'm pouring out my heart to somebody, that's vulnerable and that's trusting and that's deeply emotional from the bottom of my heart, whether it's love or brokenness. Pouring out your heart, David language, is very intimate. And then in Psalm 73, this very, very tender and intimate phrase, nothing on earth I desire besides you. I mean, you see that in a Valentine's card, in a paraphrase. There's no one on earth, there's nothing on earth that I love more than you. And that's what the psalmist is saying to the Lord. And so you've got the greatness and the goodness of God, but then you've got this intimacy and the I love you, Lord language. And that phrase, I love you, Lord, appears at least twice in Psalm 18 and Psalm 116, this pouring out. And so I think, there definitely is room and validity and need for the continuum of language from the awesome to the intimate. The Psalms tell us that, and the comprehensive nature of the songs we see in the Scripture show that.
I was just thinking about the thought of Jesus after he had died and been resurrected, and the disciples are out fishing, and Jesus is making them breakfast, and Peter comes to him, and Jesus asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? And then I love this, but in 1 Peter 1:8, this is what Peter writes, you love him even though you've never seen him. And though you do not see him now, you trust him and you rejoice with a glorious, inexpressible joy. there is something about when Jesus said to Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And the Lord says, "Well, this is the way you demonstrate your love. Feed my sheep, feed my lambs." But this beautiful picture of now Peter's writing to the church and saying, you love him even though you haven't seen him, and you are filled with, you rejoice with a glorious, inexpressible joy. When you have glorious, inexpressible joy, it's got to be connected to something.
And there's an emotional response. Like I think it's Jonathan Edwards in Religious Affections, where he says, the duty of singing praises to God seems to be appointed wholly to excite and express religious affections. So the whole idea there is like the reason God wants us to sing, the reason we use music, the reason he's created us is because it's good that our affections are expressed and our affections are stirred up towards him. And so we got to be careful not to say like, oh, I love you language is exclusively feminine. And anytime there's like, I love you language, I love the Lord, like Jody, you referred to Psalm 116, I love the Lord because he heard my cries for mercy. I mean, right there, the reason that the psalmist is saying, I love the Lord is because he has seen the awe, he's seen the wonder and the glory of a holy God who he needs to receive mercy from. And he's aware of his sin. He's aware of his need to have mercy. And so what does he say? Oh, I love the Lord. I love the Lord because he gave me mercy. So it's the awe and wonder that produced the intimacy. And so I think that what I get worried about is when we start calling language that the Psalms are using as like, oh, this is feminine or this is youth culture. And, guys, like this concept of youth culture in worship music and this concept of, how, I recently heard a pastor, he was telling this story about the boys from his youth group. They went to this youth conference and all of his like young guys were kind of sitting in the back row with their arms crossed, kind of critiquing the event because there's all these like young girls and young people up front, like jumping and dancing and clapping and singing. And these guys were kind of obviously not used to that expression. And so they sort of turned their nose down at that. And the idea was like, oh, this kind of youth culture kind of worship. Is emotional response, is jumping, dancing during worship, is that signs of the feminization of worship or youth culture worship? What do you guys think about that?
Well, David was a dancing man. So we know that. In fact, I think as I look through the scriptures, he is the first man that I think the Bible talks about dancing. Could be wrong, but I think so. And so he was a dancing man, and he was dancing in a celebration of God's glory. And I think we could just say that dancing is not a sign of feminization, but of joy and victory and passion for God's greatness. And how we express Matthew 22, the great commandment to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. In the West, we probably need to tap into our dancing feet a little bit more. And I imagine it would be fun. Wouldn't it be fun to take a little trip around the world and the three of us go on a trip? Maybe if there's some people with some resources out there listening who love this podcast, they send us on a world trip.
I'm in.
Good. We'll do 5 continents and 3 churches on 5 continents and just explore how believers in different nations worship. And I suspect we'd be surprised that there's a lot more dancing and exuberance than we typically see in North America.
Yeah, I think we get back to the camps and how we're so quick to throw rocks at the other one. My good friend Bob Coughlin tells a story. He told me of going to the Anaheim Vineyard Church, and he was in the worship service, and he was sitting there, and his heart wasn't engaged. He was more maybe like the boys that you just mentioned, Rob, in the youth group, critical, wondering why they weren't do this, why don't you do that? And they just finished the singing portion of the gathering, and they said, well, why don't you turn around and greet someone before you sit down? And Bob turned to his right, and there was an older gentleman there that had tears coming down his face. And he grabbed Bob's hand and he said, wasn't the presence of Jesus so beautiful in this place this morning? And, Bob tells that story of how dangerous it can be for us at times too. And I think we've gotten really good at critiquing. We've gotten really good at walking the walls, so to speak, of this is what we do and we can't do anything else. And I would say to both camps, if there's a heavy emphasis on head, on truth, and you're fearful of emotions running amok, so therefore we want to stay clear of that. We want to avoid feeling for the sake of it, things going south. I would say lean in to who Jesus is. Lean into the truth that we're singing about and let that impact your heart. And I would say to the other camp that is, it's all about your emotions. I would say fill your heart and your head with the glories of Calvary. Fill your heart and your head with the wonders of the gospel and the majesty of God that we see throughout the storyline of the Bible, and let that move you in a way to love and adore and worship Jesus.
Yeah, when we're talking about kind of the path that we're advocating, it's not for one or the other. It's for knowledge of Christ, gazing. This is what Jesus tells the Samaritan woman in John 4, right? This is heart and head. It's spirit and truth. It's the truth roots us. And then it's the heart expression, the affections being stirred of that truth. The Bible has tons of expressions that are available. Clapping, loud shouts, dancing, loud music, bowing down, all kinds of things. And so just because somebody's up in the front and they're dancing, it doesn't mean they're being suckered in by emotion. I think it's, we can't just be so close in our definition of these things, close in our definitions, that we have no space to allow for some swaying in our worship services, even if it's just an organ kind of playing a hymn, or if it's a piano player and a guitar player. And so I think that, I'm curious what you guys think about this, is part of the reaction to like style, because often I find the guys who are online saying, oh, women's too feminized. Yes, well, what kind of music do you like? And it's always like, well, it's Skillet and it's like Demon Hunter. And I'm like, you can't do that at church. Like, what? So, or they go to hymns, it's like, oh, we only sing hymns here. And it's played by blocky chords on a piano or an organ, dun, 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 and that's masculine. Anything with a 6/8 rhythm is masculine. What do you do with preference or style comments like that? Are there any merits to that? Is playing the piano in a flowery way, are pads inherently feminine, but are blocky chords to a 6/8 rhythm masculine? What do you do with that kind of accusation?
Yeah, and it's interesting how not only our faith but our expressions of worship are so enculturated. We think they're biblical, but they're a lot more driven by the sphere or by the arena, or I'm talking the sphere in Las Vegas. So where do we take our cues from for what is what? And is it top 40 music in the latest band, or is it the Psalms, and is it biblical principles? And you can take, for example, a 6/8 time signature and sing about catching some fish in the midst of galing winds. And some guys will be all excited, and get those guys in a church singing that, and they'll be excited. It's a 6/8 song. It's like a shanty, but they're singing about fish, but they'll all be excited. Yeah. It's not even about Jesus. So lyrics aside, time signatures, move people, and, drums move people. And on the other hand, a great Nord keyboard pad will move people in a different way. So, but I do think that God has, at least in terms of the musical expression, he's created time signatures, and he's created 3/4 and 6/8 and 4/4, and he's given us the ability to enjoy drums and beautiful violins and strings and pads and all of them. I like to think of it both, not only the music and the time signatures and songs old and new. I just call it the palette. God has given us a big, broad palette to work with, to utilize, and you don't just want all drums, and you don't just want all old songs, and you don't just want all 6/8 songs. He's given us a beautiful comprehensive nature of a lot of things that we can use as planners, as worship leaders, to explore these moods and these moments and these emotions and these truths and these aspects of God's character and our testimony and intimacy. And wisdom, I believe, says that there are in front of us on a given Sunday morning people who love 6/8, but there's others who love Nord pads, and there's people who love songs under 60 beats a minute, and those who are jazzed by over 132 beats a minute. So let's use them all, because the heart of God receives them all. And I think we need to say so many different things, and we can use these to say all these different things.
I wonder if we start with our own hearts, and we ask ourselves, why am I resistant to this? And I think of the multiple commands in the Psalms to sing, to clap, to shout to the Lord, to dance, to lift holy hands, to bow, to stand in awe. And I think that's just a spattering or a sampling of emotions that are appropriate in the beholding the glory of God. And so maybe the question we should start with is not, that's this, and I could never do this, but maybe we should start with, if these are commands, are there any that I'm actually not being obedient to? and if I'm not, why not? And I think that might be a great place to start. Like our own hearts. If you can get up and get excited and scream your head off at a sporting event, but you come to church on Sunday and you hold your coffee in your hand and you are disengaged and your heart is far from you, or your heart is far from Jesus and who he is, then there's something wrong. And that is not the place to say, oh, I don't sing because they sing these kind of songs. I think we should start here and say, I don't sing because there isn't a song in my heart. I've wandered, and I'm drinking from other cisterns and wells that are just, it's not satisfying me like Jesus can.
It is the danger with taking an expression and calling it feminine, and then because then you can like go to the Bible and look at a psalm, and David does this. And didn't his wife criticize him for the same thing? This is what Michal did. She goes, how could you dance like that? You're embarrassing yourself in front of the people of God. And she was clearly wrong. And so we need to be careful that we aren't, first of all, using feminine as some sort of like grenade, like throwing it out there as some sort of attack on a certain style of music that I just don't like. I'm probably never going to be into certain styles of music. Like I've been able to travel to Dominican Republic. I've been able to go to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I've seen a lot of different styles of worship music that, hey, God bless you. Love it. It's just not my style. I'm going to have my own style. But in no way could I look at that style of music and those instruments and say, well, they're not, that's X or Y. What I'm looking for is the content, the substance of the worship. Is it truth-based, and is it leading to that truth, reflecting on that truth? Is it leading to Jesus being glorified and enjoyed by his people? If that's what's happening, whether people are loud or quiet, then I think that's fine. You can have taste. I mean, we all have taste. You're allowed to have taste. And so, guys, I want to maybe, as we kind of bring this conversation to a close, like let's say you've got some guys in your church, and maybe you've had this, who come up to you and they're like, oh, brother, I'm so sick and tired of all these feminine songs, like this feminine music. Like, why can't we sing some songs about spiritual warfare and battle? And, how would you counsel a brother in that situation? And what would you say to those who look around and they look at a lot of top worship songs and they're just going, man, this is just, I would never invite my friends to church because I'm kind of embarrassed of the music that we're singing. How would you counsel somebody in that situation?
An attitude like that for me, I would actually want to explore a person's walk with the Lord, because that really feels like it's tipped more to style than it is to substance and to the heart behind it. So I think that is not a worship team or song vocabulary conversation. It's more a person's walk with the Lord and a discipleship issue. And I would invite that person to explore the Psalms just like we've been doing today and say, hey, what do the Psalms say? And then challenge that individual to, as Pat just said, examine their own heart and what are they really looking for? Is this scratching your musical itch, or is this actually giving a worship expression that is worthy of God from the depths of who you are? That would be one of the challenges I would have for an individual. And again, you got to have the scriptures open. And Pat said it earlier, but this Psalm 27, I want to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord. And there's something that, like David was the man's man. He's the soldier. He's the bear destroyer, the Goliath killer, the king, and he's the tender psalmist at the same time. And it's like, you want to know what a man's man is? That's a man's man.
Yeah,
man's man is someone who's fierce and courageous, but tender and vulnerable. Grow into that in your heart, and grow into that in your expressions corporately. Paul the Apostle, this is not a song, but his testimony is, I want to know Christ. In other words, everything else doesn't matter. I'm just pursuing Jesus. And that's about relationship, and that's about love, and that's about what you give your heart to. And if that sounds feminine, well, Paul's a man's man, and he's going after Christ with all he's got. And so I think it's a teaching time for all of us.
And I don't want to turn this into like a counseling thing, but sometimes I do wonder if some of it is just, as some men, we're just uncomfortable with those kinds of expressions of love because we ourselves never really received it. And there's no good model that I've had for my father leaning over and kissing me on the cheek and telling me he loves me and telling me he's proud of me. And so I don't know how to express those sorts of feelings and emotions to the Lord because I've never received them. And so sometimes our uncomfortableness with these things, it's just there's a little brokenness in our own life. And so dwelling upon the tenderness of the Lord's love for us, dwelling on the nature of our Father and his compassion, his empathy, his love can help kind of flex those muscles a little more. And if that's just if our concern is the I love you, gaze upon the beauty of the Lord as feminine, then we can kind of maybe evaluate, well, why do we think that? Where does that kind of thought come from? Pat, what would you counsel?
I was just thinking Paul in Ephesians 3:19, he prays for the church at Ephesus that they would know the love of Christ, and that word know is experience the love of Christ. And I would probably say, have you had an experience of the love of Christ? And if you have, how can that not move you to want to, the psalmist, bless the Lord, all my soul, and all that is, everything that's within me, bless his name. I want, if it's okay, I want to read one paragraph out of Desiring God, chapter 3, and then I'm done. But it says, through long drinking at the broken cistern of mud pie pleasures, many have lost almost all capacity for delighting in God. And then he ends with this. He says, worship services across the land bear the scars of this process. For many, Christianity has become the grinding out of general doctrinal laws from collections of biblical facts. But childlike wonder and awe have died. And I love this. He says, the scenery and poetry and music of the majesty of God have dried up like a forgotten peach at the back of the refrigerator. And if that's you, if your ability to behold the majesty of God and not be moved by that, maybe you're like that peach that's dried up at the back of the refrigerator, and God wants to He longs to move towards you, and he says, "Come to me." He says, I'm at your door knocking. Will you let me in? And I'll come to you. And so I would just encourage you, maybe don't even start in church. Just try in your closet or in your bedroom and just say, Jesus, I love you. I want to love you more. Would you, Holy Spirit, would you awaken my heart to the glories of God, the glories of Christ, and let that be fuel so that I could delight in him and love him and never think ever again whether this is a feminine or a masculine song. It's my heart is just engaged because I love Christ.
And I think you can be in a few places. You can be in either extremes. You can say, I locate myself here, or I locate myself here. And as you're talking, Pat, I'm thinking of Luke 15, the return of the prodigal son, and this beautiful phrase talking about intimacy. Luke 15, verse 20. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and listen to this, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Mm-hmm. And so there's, boy, what a beautiful picture that is. The embrace and the kisses and the closeness of the Father. And Pat, as you were just saying, I personally, if I can locate myself somewhere in the middle, and not saying that I'm balanced in these things, but I want both. I want to live in Luke 15. I want that embrace. And I want to be on the other side too. I want to be like, the writer who wrote How Great Thou Art, who was in the middle of a thunderstorm and beheld God's awe and wonder of his power and his majesty. And I want glimpses of greatness and glory, and I want long drinks from the well of intimacy and tenderness. I want both. I need both because I'm deficient in both areas and in both things, and I want to grow. And as leaders, I think that is a place for us as leaders to say we want our congregations to experience the greatness and the glory and the goodness and the nearness. And Piper, he says, and I will just counter back with another Piper, not counter, but I will add another Piper quote. He said, what the church needs every Sunday is a fresh vision, compelling direction, and deep and strong inspiration. We need to stretch the mental and emotional capacities of our people with the greatness of God, the unsearchable riches of Christ, the grandeur of the work of his salvation, and the immeasurable glory of our eternal future at God's right hand with pleasures forevermore. And then he says, God is greatly to be known, and then he says, greatly to be loved, greatly to be served, greatly to be desired and enjoyed. And boy, doesn't that just kind of wrap that whole thing, Just see the greatness. Greatness produces the ability for us to love him deeply.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We hope that it was helpful for you. And as you're wrestling through this, if something jumped out to you and this was helpful, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at worshipgodpodcast@gmail.com. Please share this episode if it was beneficial. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.
Worship God is a production of the Gospel Coalition Canada. For more Christ-exalting resources, go to ca.thegospelcoalition.org.